In order to understand the effects that climate change will have on species and their distributions in the future, we need to first better understand what causes the current patterns of species distributions. In this video, we will explore the topic of biogeography. Throughout this course, we have referred to the theory of island biogeography and how the size and distance between habitats influences the number of species present in an area. But here, we will be looking at the factors that influence broader patterns of species distribution, including things like latitude and elevation. Biogeography is the study of the distribution of species and ecosystems in geographic space and through geological time. It is an interdisciplinary branch of research that draws on ecology, paleontology, geology, and climatology, among others, to answer questions about why species are found where they are and how long they have been found there. It is generally focused on relating physical geography in the abiotic environment, things like climate, soils, geology, water, and landforms, with the spatial and temporal distribution of plants and animals. There are four central themes to research in biogeography. First is the classification of geographic regions based on the species that are found in a particular area. Second is the reconstruction of historical species compositions in order to better understand evolutionary processes and how the biodiversity of a particular region has changed over time. This leads to the third theme, which is to provide explanations for the patterns of species diversity, such as explaining why the tropics are more diverse than polar regions. Finally, biogeography seeks to explain patterns in the geographic variation of the characteristics of individuals and populations of closely related species. We have talked a lot in this course about the influence that humans have on the distribution of different species, but even without human influence, life would still have distinct distribution patterns across the planet. It is these patterns and the physical and environmental factors behind them that will be the focus in this video. Biogeography as a science really got its start during the major ages of exploration and colonialism during the 18th and 19th centuries. Naturalists often tagged along on these expeditions, collecting samples of biodiversity from around the world. For example, Charles Darwin was famously part of the second voyage of the HMS Beagle, which aimed to survey Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego in South America and strengthen Britain's presence on the continent. It was through these types of collections that scientists began to notice trends in species distributions. They began to notice that the patterns of species distribution were not random, implying that there was some underlying causal mechanism, some process or set of processes that was causing the patterns of biodiversity that they saw across the world. They noticed that some places had higher numbers of species, they had higher species richness than other places. And they also noticed that similar habitats had similar sets of species, even if they were on the other side of the planet, separated by huge oceans. For example, large flightless birds fill similar niches in South America, Australia, and Africa through the rhea, emu, and ostrich respectively. These observations eventually led to the theories of both evolution and plate tectonics, but today we are going to focus on the influence that these observations had on biogeography and the hypotheses that were proposed to account for the distribution and diversity of organisms across the planet. Comte de Buffon was a French naturalist who hypothesized that all species originated in the Arctic at some point in the past when the climate was more hospitable, and then spread into the Americas and southward into Asia and Africa, changing as they colonized climatically and ecologically different regions. Of course, we now know that this is not how species evolved and spread out around the world, but it does highlight the ties to colonialism and imperialism which are common in science, and that still influence our thinking today. And to Buffon's theory, all species originated in Northern Europe and then spread out to the rest of the world, able to adapt to so many different conditions because of their inherent superiority and capabilities. Now, in addition to these now just proven theories, de Buffon did make two key observations which greatly influenced the development of biogeography and still influence the field today. The first is what is now called the first principle of biogeography, or Buffon's law, which states that climatologically similar but geographically separate regions of the world have similar biotic assemblages. This is why the Mediterranean-type climates of the Mediterranean Basin, Southern California, central Chile, and South Africa's Western Cape all have similar vegetations, as you can see in the images here. He also observed that the climate of a particular area and its species were dynamic and subject to change over time. While Buffon's law and his other contributions to biogeography were primarily born from his observations on birds and mammals in the tropics, Johanna Foster was able to show that Buffon's law applied to not only birds and mammals in the tropics, but to plants as well as to all regions of the world. He was the first to describe a floristic zonation along latitudinal gradients. In other words, he found that there is a relationship between vegetation and climatic conditions. He also noted that there was a higher species diversity of plants near the equator compared to the poles, which he explained through latitudinal variations in the surface heat across the planet. This theory has largely stood the test of time, though in addition to heat, scientists now believe that these differences are also caused by energy availability and climate stability. The tropics receive more solar energy than polar regions, resulting in higher levels of net primary productivity, which is the energy stored by plants and other primary producers. The theory is that the more primary producers there are, the more individuals can be supported in an area, and the more species there will be overall. The tropics also have a relatively stable climate, as there is little variation of temperature and the amount of daylight throughout the year, compared to the more temperate or polar regions where these factors fluctuate wildly across the seasons. The high levels of primary productivity and the relatively stable climate of the tropics have also allowed for evolutionary forces to produce a wide variety of species. Because species in the tropic tend to be specialists occupying narrow niches, they tend to have smaller ranges. In other words, species in the tropics tend to be only found in a few localized places, compared to species in the temperate or polar regions of the world, which tend to be wider ranging. Alexander von Humboldt, a 19th century German geographer, was able to further generalize Buffon's law and Foster's work to describe the distributional patterns in plants and animals along elevational zones. Essentially, those same types of patterns in species distribution that play out in 2D across lines of latitude around the world also play out in 3 dimensions on mountain slopes. There is a natural layering of ecosystems that occurs at distinct elevations because of variations in temperature, humidity, soil composition, and solar radiation, which consequently support different plants and animal species. For example, as one reaches higher and higher elevations, air temperature decreases, which directly influences the length of the growing season at different elevations of the mountain. This is why mountain regions are often dominated by forests in their valleys and around the base of the mountain, but as you climb up the mountain, the forest begins to thin out before it disappears altogether when it is replaced by small and hardy alpine plants. These patterns are known as altitudinal zonation. Although you might recognize his name because he independently conceived of the theory of evolution through natural selection at the same time as Charles Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace also made considerable contributions to the field of biogeography. He looked at the patterns of plants and animals from around the world, and he argued that there were 6 major regions for biodiversity, all separated by oceans, major mountain chains, or large deserts, which are shown on the map here: the Nearctic, Palearctic, Afrotropical, Indo-Malayan, Australasian, Neotropical, and Oceanian. These realms are still used today and delineate large areas of the Earth where organisms have been evolving in relative isolation over long periods of time, as they are separated from one another by large geographic barriers such as oceans, large deserts, or high mountain ranges. Because of this, they have formed unique ecological communities with unique evolutionary histories. Biogeography is often focused on 4 key abiotic factors that control vegetation, as the vegetation in an area dictates what animals will be supported there. The first of these factors is precipitation. By this, we mean not only the amount of precipitation that an area receives, but also the intensity, frequency, and seasonality of rain, snow, and sleet. Soil is an important factor to consider as different soil types are formed by different minerals and organic materials which produce different combinations of nutrients, which in turn supports different types of plants. The amount of sunlight that an area receives is an important factor in determining what vegetation will be able to grow in a particular place, and the amount of sunlight is influenced by a number of macro and micro scale factors. On the broad macro scale, an area's location on the planet will influence the amount of and patterns of sunlight that it receives, as the higher latitudes towards the poles have more extremes in the amount of sunlight depending on the time of year, with very dark winters and very light summers, compared to the lower latitudes in the tropics, where the amount of sunlight per day is fairly consistent year-round. On a finer, more micro scale, factors like the presence of valleys and slopes will influence the amount of direct sunlight that an area receives. The final major abiotic factor that affects what vegetation can be supported at a particular place is temperature, which, like was mentioned with precipitation and sunlight, needs to consider the whole temperature regime of an area, the differences in temperature that occur between seasons, and even between night and day. These factors have helped us develop maps like these and the concept of ecoregions, which are large areas that contain a characteristic, distinct assemblage of natural communities and species. The biodiversity in ecosystems that characterize an ecoregion tends to be distinct from that of other ecoregions. This map shows the 846 ecoregions of the world. We have talked about how this classification of ecoregions can be used to guide conservation efforts through the important factor of representation, but it can also help us to better understand the current patterns of biodiversity and how they may change under climate change, which is the focus of our lectures this week.